Hi there, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video we'll be talking about the gonads. We're going to start off this lesson with a very brief introduction to the ovaries and the testes, but because we'll be looking more in depth at them when we get to the reproductive system. So we'll talk just a little bit about their structures and the gametes that they produce, and then we'll switch gears and really talk more in depth about their endocrine function. Alright, so the gonads are a paired set of gamete-producing sex glands, and they come in two varieties. So we have ovaries, which produce ova, or are large gametes, and testes, which produce sperm, or are small gametes. It's probably not a great surprise, considering the way we talk about them in popular culture, to learn that these also have endocrine function. They produce hormones. And like many of the large endocrine glands that we've talked about already, these are going to be regulated by the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary pathway. So in this case, our releasing hormone is going to be gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that will tell the anterior pituitary gland to release two tropic hormones. So follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. And I want to emphasize here that these are both released whether an individual has ovaries or testes. So it's not like one is for ovaries, one is for testes. Both stimulate both sets of gonads. All right, so let's start off talking about ovaries here. Ovaries are pelvic organs, meaning that they remain within the abdominopelvic cavity during development and after birth. They are typically associated with the uterus and the uterine tubes, but I do want to point out they are not physically attached to those uterine tubes at all. Okay, the oocytes, which are unfertilized ova, they are germ cells that have migrated to the ovaries from the yolk sac during development. So the ovaries are going to house the oocytes, but they don't produce them, okay? At the time of birth, I should say, the ovaries are very well stocked with over 400,000 oocytes, which is just an absolutely absurd number and more than anyone could ever possibly need. Blood supply to the ovaries is going to come primarily from the gonadal artery and vein. Specifically here, now that we know they are coming to ovaries, we can call them ovarian artery and vein 2. The ovarian arteries arise from the abdominal aorta here bilaterally and extend down into the pelvic cavity to reach the ovaries. The gonadal vein, similarly, on the right side, it's going to drain into the IVC, and on the left side, it will drain into the left renal vein and then over to the IVC. Now, you may be looking at this and saying, these are just ridiculously long, Dr. Kingston. And you know what? Yes, they are. Both gonads start developing relatively high up in the abdomen, and during development, they are pulled down into either the pelvic cavity or out into the scrotum. But in doing so, they don't give up their blood supply. They keep it and they stretch it out behind them, so we end up with these very long gonadal vessels. Okay, and we can see here what this looks like in practice. So here's the ovary, here's the ovarian artery and vein coming down, and they're covered up in peritoneum, and we name this the suspensory ligament because it looks like the ovary is hanging off of them as they drape down into the pelvic cavity here. All right, ovaries have a pretty significant anastomosis here with the uterine and vaginal arteries. So that comes up into the body of the uterus, and they anastomose through this little mesentery, which we have not talked about mesenteries yet, but we will get there, no worries. All right. The reproductive function of the ovaries is to house those oocytes or egg cells until they are mature. And to do this, they keep them nice and cozy inside little cellular envelopes called follicles. Maturation of oocytes doesn't happen all at once, so it's not like you hit puberty and suddenly all the oocytes are mature. Only a few of them are going to begin to mature every ovarian cycle. Okay. During the beginning of this, several of these little primordial follicles with primordial oocytes in them continue the process of meiosis, or splitting themselves into haploid cells with half of the parent's DNA. During the course of the ovarian cycle, then you'll see these follicles are going to grow larger and larger and larger. They fill up with little cells and they fill up with fluid, and they blow up like balloons. Now, eventually, one of these follicles, usually, sometimes it's more, is going to win, and it wins by being the biggest and the best. So that one gets so big that its follicle then is going to burst open, and that oocyte is expelled out into the abdominal cavity. Okay, we call this ovulation. Boop, just like that. Okay, so let's talk about the hormones that are governing this process now. So the specific cells in the ovaries that have endocrine function are called granulosa cells. And they make up a large part of a maturing follicle. So I want you to look over here at our image. Okay, here we have an oocyte, 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 oocyte. So they're just changing a little bit, becoming more mature in each picture. And we have granulosa cells. They are the blue things here, and the little blue circles here, and here, and here. Okay, so what's happening here is as this follicle matures, these granulosa cells are proliferating. So they're splitting and they're making more of themselves. Okay, and when the follicle ruptured, some of these are going to go out and be ovulated with the oocyte, but some of them also stay inside the ovary, and those are going to form what's known as the corpus luteum, which is kind of a little pocket left behind after ovulation. All right, so the endocrine function of these granulosa cells is regulated by hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and again, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and then follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone will act directly on the granulosa cells, and they tell them to do things like secrete estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. The estrogen and progesterone that are secreted by the granulosa cells regulate both the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle together. So estrogen tells those granulosa cells to proliferate, and it tells the follicles, which are made up of the granulosa cells, it makes those follicles mature. At the same time, it is promoting growth and maintenance of the uterine lining, so getting thicker and thicker. It has a number of other functions that it carries out in the body. So, excuse me, it allows more calcium to be pulled out from bones. It puts fat deposits in specific places like hips and thighs. These all produce a suite of traits that we refer to as secondary sex characteristics. Okay, it is not terribly important for this course that you know what those are. All right, and then progesterone also has many small functions, but the big one is that it helps to maintain the uterine lining. I always think of it as kind of the gardener. Estrogen tells the uterine lining, build, 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 and progesterone comes in and says, let's do this artistically, and make sure everything is at the right level. Okay, so let's have a look at how this is going to work. So I've put gonadotropin releasing hormone on here already, and now the anterior pituitary is going to release follicle stimulating hormone. And that is going to do exactly what its name says, and that is to start stimulating the growth of a few ovarian follicles. The granulosa cells that have been stimulated by FSH are going to proliferate, and they're going to begin secreting their own hormones. So they're going to be putting out estrogen and inhibin. That estrogen tells them to divide even faster. And of course, because we're working with our hormonal message in a bottle delivery service here, that estrogen also makes its way back to the hypothalamus, where it stimulates the release of more gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is going to tell the anterior pituitary to release our second tropic hormone, which is luteinizing hormone, or LH. All right, if we come back to this slide here, we can see these levels changing right down here. So here we have FSH and LH being secreted at low levels, and we have increasing levels of estrogen as those follicles begin to mature, okay? We see it is really kind of reaching a fever pitch right here. And if we look at what's going on in the anterior pituitary at the same time, we see this is when we're getting this really big surge of luteinizing hormone as well. So estrogen levels rise, and then suddenly we get this rise in LH levels in response. Now, if you are attempting to get pregnant and you are testing for when you're going to ovulate, this is what you're testing for. You're testing for this big surge in luteinizing hormone that will occur just before ovulation. All right, so what that surge of luteinizing hormone does is it weakens the walls of the maturing follicle. Now, we have got quite a buildup of proliferating granulosa cells and fluid building up in here, right? So this is blowing up like a balloon. And because more cells means more estrogen, and more estrogen means more cells, eventually something has to give, right? And that's going to be the wall of the follicle. So the wall bursts open, and the oocyte is expelled from the ovary. And once that happens, the granulosa cells are still not finished. So some of them are coming out with the oocyte, but some are left behind. The ones that are left behind are going to patch up the hole that's left here by ovulation and form the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is a cluster of endocrine cells that will continue to produce estrogen and progesterone for the next 2 or so weeks, which is roughly how long it can take the oocyte to move through the rest of the reproductive tract. So they keep enough estrogen and progesterone going just to maintain the uterine lining for those 2 weeks. And then once those 2 weeks are finished, the corpus luteum will kind of collapse in on itself and become a scar tissue. All right, so coming back here again, we can see we are now, here's ovulation. All right, we had our big luteinizing hormone surge, ovulation happened, those levels drop back down to normal. But what's happening with the formation of the corpus luteum here, we can see that we've got, again, rising progesterone and estrogen levels. And at the end of 2 weeks, once those go back down to base level, we are back at the beginning of the cycle. And we can start it all over again. So fun. Okay, so that is how ovarian hormones work. Now let's take a look at what they're doing in the testes. The testes are also paired glands, but unlike the ovaries, they've descended outside of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and they now sit down in the scrotum. So they exit the abdomen during development along a pathway called the inguinal canal, and you can see that here. Here's the opening of it, and here's the exit down into the scrotum. And just like the ovaries, they pull their blood supply along with them. Very much unlike the ovaries, though, the testes are constantly producing spermatozoa. So they do produce things, they don't just hold on to them the way the ovaries do. The blood supply for the testes is actually the exact same thing that we saw for the ovaries. So we have gonadal vessels again, this time specifically testicular vessels, arising from the aorta and traveling down to reach the testes. Once again, the veins do the same thing. On the left, they are going to drain to the left renal vein. On the right, they drain to the right. They drain to the right IVC. Yes, they drain directly to the IVC. All right, the testes are going to carry the same vein and artery with them down into the scrotum. When they pull through the abdominal wall here, through that inguinal canal, they pick up a number of coatings, right? So a couple of layers of muscle and fascia that altogether get called the spermatic cord, and those surround and make a little envelope for the blood vessels in the testes as they are suspended here within the scrotum. Okay, so like I was saying, the testes are continuously producing new spermatozoa after an individual reaches sexual maturity. And they have a long, skinny mess of tubules that serve as the site for this. So coiled up here within the testicle, we have a couple miles worth of seminiferous tubules. Don't quote me on that number. I'm being hyperbolic. All right, so this illustration depicts the wall of the seminiferous tubules here. And the way that it shows this, I'm not going to be upset with you if it's difficult figuring out which end points into the tube and which end points outside. So I am going to just make a few quick sketches here to make things clear. So what you are seeing is just a very small section of a tubule. Okay, I'm going to draw a cross section here of a seminiferous tubule. Okay, it's a very sketchy sketch, all right? And what the wall here is the same as this pink here. So this is the basement membrane of the seminiferous tubules, and it's the same thing making this red stuff here. Just below that basement membrane, inside the tube, are what are called sustentacular cells. Okay, so I can kind of outline for you where they are here. They go in between all the little sperm like this, like so. They're very odd shaped. Okay, so that's a sustentacular cell, and those are sitting in here, like so. I'm not going to draw all of them because that would take too long. So what's happening just below this basement membrane, we have a number of stem cells that are going to be splitting into spermatozoa through the process of meiosis. So what happens, the farther down you go here, the more mature these cells will be. Okay, so we can see they're splitting into 2 here and down into 4 here. And the more splits we have happening, the further down these maturing sperm cells get pushed until eventually we see our mostly mature buddies hanging out down here. Okay, and they will eventually be released down into the lumen of the tube, which is down this way. All right, so the process of maturation begins at the outside of this tube, and the sperm are going to move their way in like so as they mature, and eventually they're released from the wall and into the center of the tube where they can go swim on to their next destination. All right, so let's start another map of endocrine function, this time for the testes. We've got our gonadotropin releasing hormone being secreted by the hypothalamus, and that is going to tell the anterior pituitary to do 2 things, one of which is to secrete follicle stimulating hormone. Now, we don't have follicles here like we did in the ovaries, but we do have those sustentacular cells that I just showed you. And in this case, follicle stimulating hormone is going to help regulate these sustentacular cells, cellular processes, to make them a hospitable environment for sperm meiosis and development. Okay. All right, one other big difference between the ovaries and the testes is that the primary endocrine cells here are not the same as the support cells. So in the ovaries, we had those granulosa cells that kind of just did everything endocrine and support. Here, they are completely separate entities. So we've got the sustentacular cells for support, and then we have a group of endocrine cells that live in the basement membrane here. And these can just be called endocrine cells, or we can call them Leydig cells. We're trying to get away from eponyms, so things that are named after specific people, but this is well known enough that you probably should know that they can be called Leydig cells as well. These are going to be, once again, regulated by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, and their job is to secrete testosterone. Testosterone, in turn, is going to target those sustentacular cells, the support cells. Its job is to promote the blood-testis barrier. Now, this prevents immune cells from your own bloodstream from attacking developing sperm cells. So sperm cells are derived from an individual's own tissues, right? But they are only carrying half the DNA, so your immune cells don't recognize them as self, and they will attack them. Having this barrier prevents any sort of immune cells from getting in and causing infertility by destroying developing sperm cells. Okay, the other thing it's going to do is help to initiate meiosis, or division of the spermatocytes that are maturing here. So meiosis, again, is forming haploid cells with half the DNA of the parent. And once these cells are mature, it will release them from the sustentacular cells as well. Okay, again, like estrogen and progesterone, testosterone has a lot of secondary functions that produce secondary sex characteristics. And again, this is things from like driving libido to hair growth patterns. You don't need to focus on these for this course. All right, let's start adding this onto our map 2. All right, so we have our anterior pituitary now secreting luteinizing hormone as well as follicle stimulating hormone. That luteinizing hormone talks to the endocrine cells, and it tells them to secrete testosterone. Testosterone is going to talk to the sustentacular cells. They're going to keep that blood-testis barrier up, initiate meiosis, and release the sperm when they're all done with them. All right, and when those sustentacular cells get full, they have their own little messenger in inhibin that they will secrete, and it is inhibin's job to shut the whole party down by turning off FSH secretion. All right, and with that, we come full circle back to the beginning. All right, that is going to bring us to the end of this video. So as your practice question here, answer me this. Which hormone is secreted by the corpus luteum? All right, the correct answer was both estrogen and progesterone. All right, remember the corpus luteum is the little body that is formed by the granulosa cells after ovulation that exists to secrete estrogen and progesterone through the end of the ovarian and uterine cycles. And that is the end. I will see you in the next video.